Dive in.
Do you think there's any difference, or do you both think there's any difference? Ben's belief or Ben's Jewish and your belief is Christian, comes from the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
Does that matter at all? Whatever differences there are in that little place where you're both saying, we see the reasons why our morals and ethics and all that come from this. We're also acknowledging, the real world and biology and all of those things. Whatever differences you may have, which I don't even know that any of the three of us know what those differences are, do they even matter?
They might. That would be a lovely
I'd love to figure out if there are.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. For me, it depends on the brand of religion that a person is espousing. So,
let's just do this with
now. Listen carefully to what Ben says here, because it's interesting.
Sure. You too.
I mean, so. My feeling, I'm writing a book on this right now, actually. There are certain principles that obviously undergird Christianity that are from the Judaic tradition. I mean, that clearly.
It's like a manifestation of the prophetic tradition.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's essentially an attempt to merge Jerusalem with Athens, is I think the book of John is the most obvious example, using the Logos as sort of the unifying feature, and writing the whole thing in Greek, right? I mean, that was not the lingua franca of the time. That was not.
Now. Yeah. For all you Ben Shapiro fans, you're now sitting there going, huh? Obviously, the materials that Ben is accessing probably wouldn't come from our perspective, because we need to recognize Bible-believing, historical Trinitarians. Jesus really rose from the dead. It's not just a metaphor. It actually happened. The stone was rolled away. The body came out, the whole 9 yards. People who believe that God spoke, that the scriptures are theopneustos. We are a minority. You need to understand that. We often act like we are the majority because we believe those things are definitional. But when it comes to someone outside the faith looking at Christians, we're a small group. And that can be very confusing to people, and it won't help us if we don't realize that in our trying to talk to people. We need to be aware of the fact that they're going to hear from others things very, very, very different than what we're saying, and we need to be quick to recognize that and be able to respond and explain. So what you just heard isn't all that uncommon, though the entire New Testament was written in Greek. It was the lingua franca of the day, and so there's nothing unusual that a book written probably after the destruction of Jerusalem would be written in the lingua franca of the day, which is Koine Greek. But the point was that he points to the Logos, and he assumes, as much literature you're going to read will assume, that the Logos is being simply borrowed lock, stock, and barrel from Greek philosophy. And certainly the concept of Logos is found before John, but what that misses is the deep rootage of John in the Hebrew scriptures and in Hebrew thought and in the Memra and the Devar and the Hebrew concepts of word and revelation, and the fact that the Logos is impersonal in Greek philosophy, whereas in John the Logos is intensely personal, and the fulfillment of the prophecies and so on and so forth. So, when you listen to men like this, who are not Christians, they may, by common grace, have an understanding of categories of morality, because why? From our perspective, the reason these two men share so much in common is why? They're both made in the image of God. Now, Ben Shapiro has his lens. Jordan Peterson has a Jungian psychological lens. We're going to hear, maybe at the rate I'm going. I think Rich needs to go home at some point today. And so do I, for that matter. But they are made in the image of God, and so they can see these things, and they can see through the foolishness of the human systems that deny these things, but they're not going to agree, and they cannot create a consistent system while not believing what God has done in Jesus Christ. It's not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to put that together.
What people were speaking, except in educated circles. So all the Judaic principles, things like a God involved in history, a God who cares about individuals, the notion that you have a choice between good and evil, so choose good, and so that you will live long on the earth, right? All these things were taken forward into Christianity. The major distinctions in terms of Christianity versus Judaism.
Well, let me just stop right there real quickly. There's all sorts of other things that were taken forward. The entire prophetic emphasis upon the Messiah, the blessing of the nations, Genesis 12, Genesis 15, and of course God's self-revelation, his personal nature, and the fact that he is the one that is accomplishing history itself, is, that whole monotheism, God's revelation in nature, that man is created in the image of God, all of this stuff, which I would think would need to be mentioned, are quote-unquote brought forward and continue within the Christian faith.
Are the idea that, and again, it depends on your interpretation of Christianity. Early Christianity sort of suggested that history had ended with Christ. And then in later kind of iterations of Christianity, that was moved beyond, right? It wasn't that history had ended. It was that Christ would come back when history had reached its logical progression. The progression of history didn't end, but original messianism was, this is the Messiah, we're done, right? History is over. It was a millennialist religion.
Right. That's what very few people think that now.
That's right. So, so this is why I'm trying to distinguish, brands of Christianity, because obviously they're...
This is going to be an interesting book. I suppose what he's referring to is, at least in, when the Messiah comes, the total wrapping up of all things. And so maybe the idea is, because as Jesus himself taught, you've got, the suffering Messiah, and those, as the New Testament teaches, those before Christ had not seen the mystery being the Jews and Gentiles come together in the one body, the church, the gathering together, the elect, the fulfillment of God's purposes now for 2,000 years, the gospel going to the ends of the world, so on and so forth. From his perspective, and again, the best that you've got, if you are not a true supernaturalist, is to sort of cobble together ways of viewing what's clearly meant to be a supernatural religion in a somewhat naturalistic way. So, the earlier version was this, and later version was that. So it's all developmental. It's you're stuck going, you've got similarities with this religion over there and that religion over there, and that's why it never gets anywhere, and that kind of stuff. And it's what they've got. That's the problem in not having a truly biblical faith. But I think that's probably what he's referring to.
Serious differences, even in basic root level, between Catholicism and Calvinism and Lutheranism, and all these things have different iterations. So, my very strong belief in free will and my actual building of a moral system, and Judaism is building a moral system on the notion of free will, obviously runs directly counter to, for example, Calvinism. Right? Calvinism suggests that free will is chimerical and there's no basis for it, and that God grants you grace based on what he wants to do. So it depends on the brand of Christianity, but...
So obviously Ben doesn't have much interest in Calvinism, though I don't think he understands what we mean when we use the term free will, especially in morals and ethics, in comparison to man's inability. But the idea of a sovereign decree of God obviously is immediately dismissed by Ben Shapiro at that point. So those of you who are constantly posting Ben Shapiro videos, when the book comes out where he addresses these things, you're going to be just a tad bit on the disappointed side with what's going to be said, I'm afraid.
I think that overall the conflict between Christianity and Judaism in large measure is, especially in the early conflict, was political rather than ideological in a lot of ways. It was a new religion attempting to establish its own footing, and was angry that Jews would not join this new religion.
Not even close. Okay, let's just be clear there. Ben could use a little time with the Book of Acts and things like that. No, what was there politics involved? Well, the Sadducees were deeply involved in political alliances with Rome and stuff like that. But no, this was significantly more than primarily political alliances or Christianity being angry that the Jews just don't get on board and accept Jesus as the Messiah. A little off base there in its balance in his understanding. Yeah. We don't want to do the persecution stuff at all.
And leave behind tradition. I think that there are certain ways in which Christianity, like for example, the main distinction between Christianity and Judaism that people usually make is that Christianity is a grace-based religion and Judaism is an acts-based religion.
Now notice, they're going to be focused upon man's role, man's salvation, the idea of the revelation of Yahweh himself in human flesh, the revelation of the triune God, God's purposes, all that stuff. There isn't any place in that in Ben's understanding, and to be honest with you, there really isn't. Jungian psychology isn't big enough to hold it either. So you sort of have to filter out what we recognize as the highest transcendent messages of the New Testament, because the human traditions that you're using, whether they're Ben's Jewish human traditions in a modern garb, or Jordan Peterson's human traditions from psychology, are just not big enough to be able to contain the awesome power of the message of the incarnation, the message of the empty tomb. Just not big enough. That doesn't have categories big enough to be able to express those things.
Meaning that Judaism says you sort of earn your way into heaven, right? You earn your way toward a better life. And Christianity says if you believe, right, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, if you believe, then you're good. But the truth is that...
Now, that's not accurate either direction. I mean, hopefully at least one thing that we've learned from the new perspective argument is at least to recognize that there have been times when there were elements of grace within Jewish thought. I mean, he may be representing, the current modern, Orthodox movement, which is really removed a long way from Tannaitic Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism of the New Testament time period. But still, and then what you're going to hear here is just a classic example of and this is not meant, I'm not putting anybody down, but a very shallow understanding of the Christian message on the parts of both men in regards to relationship of works and grace. And look, if you've already put the Calvinists out the door, that's about all you've got left. Because the fullest, deepest explication of the relationship between faith alone and the necessity to walk in obedience to Christ is found in the concept of divine election, regeneration, and the nature of saving faith and the ministry of the Holy Spirit of God in conforming a people to the image of Christ. If you don't have all of that sovereign work of God, it becomes a mishmash. That's why the synergistic systems have never been able to give a coherent answer on these things. And if folks like Ben Shapiro are looking for a human autonomous synergistic foundation in Christianity to latch onto, they're going to reject the biblical perspective because they're approaching it from below rather than from the biblical revelation above. And there's always going to be misunderstanding as a result.
Christianity sort of backdoors the Judaic view by saying, if you really do believe, then you're going to act in these particular ways that demonstrate your belief.
Yeah, well, there's this weird paradoxical relationship between the idea of belief in Christianity, the belief that Christ came to save everyone from their sins, and that all you have to do is admit that and you're redeemed. Like, there's symbolic truth to that would take a long time to unpack. But there's also an injunction that goes along with that to...
If I could just mention, just real quickly, here's what happens when belief is separated from repentance. You just admit that. It's not just an admission, because it involves your own sin and your turning from your own sin, your recognition of Christ as sin bearer, the justice of God in bringing punishment against sinners. And if you try to sanitize the gospel to make it more appealing and more acceptable within scholarly circles, it doesn't make much sense. You've got to have the whole thing. It's got to be there.
Imitate Christ in your life.
Exactly.
Right? So it's like,
I feel like a lot of these distinctions are almost, some of them are almost a little false. I mean, meaning that they're either Christian mysteries of Judaism or Jewish mysteries of Christianity. And that when you get to the root of it, I mean, this is what Maimonides says, that there are significant differences between Judaism and Christianity, but his view of Christianity from a Jewish historical point of view is that Judaism was never bound to convert billions of people around the world, but Christianity was, specifically because we have a lot of crap we got to do. I mean, Jews have we have 613 commandments. Yeah. You know, we have to keep kosher. We have to do all of these things.
I appreciate you doing a lot of them for me.
Yeah, no problem. I'm taking care of it. Yeah, I'll transfer over the points in the afterlife.
I assume someone's.
I'll give you one of my afterlives. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I think that Christianity ends up doing a lot of those same things that, you know, there were supposed to be stark distinctions, just under a different guise. So when it comes to this is why, in the modern world, when the discrimination between, you know, from Christians toward Jews largely has ended, I think that what you're seeing is this tremendous confluence between particularly Orthodox Jews and observant Christians on matters of values. Because once Christianity in the late 20th century, in the mid 20th century, and in America more broadly with Christianity, because American Christianity is very different than European Christianity. Yeah. Once there was an idea that Jews were not the enemy to be converted, but maybe you still want to convert me, but we're not going to come at you with a knife, we're going to come at you with a book. Yeah. And that we share a common framework for how the world is supposed to work. You just may not agree with the second half of the book. Right? And then I think that's created a pretty good working relationship with. This is why I'm struggling to come up with what are these significant differences. And so I need.
Now, isn't it interesting that there would be a struggle to come up with the significant differences? And I don't blame that. I don't place that primarily on Ben Shapiro. Jordan Peterson is not a believing Christian. He may use Christian categories, but the idea of Jesus as Lord, and that, you know, if you want one of the major differences, there it is. What is the Christian proclamation? That Jesus is Lord of all nations, of all peoples. He's the risen Lord. He's the coming Lord. He's the reigning Lord. He's building his kingdom upon earth. And so when he uses illustration, we've got 613 commandments to be. We don't have time to be converting the world. That's your job. That flows naturally for the Christian because we're going out into Jesus's world. And every nation that stands against him, the people in the California state legislature that are standing against him, and that was another issue I was going to comment on, and I didn't. And I guess it's because I got to preach a little bit on Sunday, so I let off some of that steam. Maybe before we take calls on Thursday, I can address some of those things. But the insanity going on in California. But when they stand against Christ, which is what they are doing, by the way, that they are rebels, and that we have a message of turn, repent from your rebellion. There has been this grace that has been granted, but there will come a day of judgment. And God will judge the world by the one he raised from the dead. That was Paul's message in Acts chapter 17, and it remains our message as well. And this is one of the fundamental differences. And that will impact your moral and ethical system big time.
I need a Christian to tell me what is the significant difference. I can argue with it.
My question...
Because I know my own religion better than I know Christianity.
My question is...
Now, did you catch that? I need a Christian to tell me. Well, in all these times, in all this rubbing shoulders with political conservatives, he's not encountered a Christian that could tell him or was willing to do so? That's scary.
I mean, I don't know if the role that the state plays in Judaism and Christianity is the same. Because
now, I'm sorry, that's not the first thing I'm going to think of. I mean, yes, what he's talking about is nation of Israel, national promises versus gospel proclamation to all nations. It's no longer a national concept, which is, I think, what he's trying to express here. That is a difference, but it's a difference that pales in insignificance in comparison to the very clear and obvious reality of prophecy fulfillment. Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He's the risen King, Lord of Lords. There's where the issue is. Either he was who he claimed to be or he wasn't. And that's the fundamental issue.
I'm not sure what to make of what I would say is the Jews put a tremendous amount of emphasis on the state as a mechanism for salvation, something like that. That might be the symbolic idea that underlies the establishment of Israel. And I would say that in Christianity...
You mean the nation, or you mean like the government?
I mean the nation, but
right.
But then it gets tangled up with the government, right? So
right. This is a distinction that Christianity is a universalistic religion, right?
Yeah.
The idea is that in the kingdom of God, everyone is Christian, basically, and Judaism is not in one sense, but it is in another, which is that God identifies a nation that he treasures as his own, and he has a special relationship with that nation. But Judaism is not exclusivist with regard to who gets into heaven. So there's this basic idea in Genesis that there are commandments that are given prior to the giving of the Torah, right? That there's what we call the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 commandments that are given to the sons of Noah, meaning all mankind. And these are things like no murder, no idolatry, no adultery. They basically mirror a lot of the 10 commandments. And so the idea in Judaism is that God, it's almost like a priestly caste. God chose this specific group of people to be a light unto the nations by demonstrating what a godly lifestyle looks like if you dedicate every aspect of your life to God. And then he said to everybody else, I know not everybody else is up to this, and in fact, Judaizers are supposed to try and turn away converts, but you can still get into heaven. The idea that we are trying to force anyone into being Jewish, that's not a thing. So nationalism without the conversion...
You can think about that psychologically as an attempt to both manage the preservation of group identity, so that would be culture, a cultural identity, which has some utility, and also to be able to coexist with others who are doing things in a different way.
And again, Judaism has had a long history of just like every other religion, of...
You know, what you're going to hear as Dr. Peterson finally gets an opportunity to talk, you'll notice that Ben talks a lot more than he does. What you're going to hear is you're going to hear a professional psychologist, and he runs everything through that lens. And so you may ask, well, then why does he get so much stuff right? Because if you really observe man closely, you're observing what? A creature made in the image of God. And if God grants you some light to be able to see those things, then you're going to be able to consistently, to a point anyways, observe how human beings behave. That's why Romans 1 can be true in any culture, is the reality of man being made in the image of God. But that's not, you can't start down here and try to climb up to the truth. You're just not going to get very high when you start at the wrong point.
Sort of evolution on this stuff. Right? Like when you read the book of Joshua, there's actual forced conversion that happens in the book of Joshua. But by the time you get to early Christianity and midpoint Judaism, right, because Judaism is a lot older than Christianity, then you're already talking about Jews who are not looking to convert people. They sort of want to live in their own state. They don't want to bother anyone else for the most part. So the idea of like a tidal wave of conquering Jews going out, I mean, even to think about it now is hilarious, right? Nobody thinks about it that way, except if you're a conspiratorial nutbag. But it's but
the Inquisitions usually work the other way.
That's right.
So anything that you might have heard Ben just say, would anything jive with a fundamental belief that you have that would cause a problem? You know what I mean? Like cause a problem in society.
Well, I think that one potential problem that's worth discussing, but it would take forever to discuss it, is the relative role of the individual versus the state. I mean, you see this argued out in the prophetic books in the Old Testament.
Yes.
I mean, there's the Jewish state, and it's sort of the central player in some sense, but there's clear evidence that it can become corrupt, it can fall away, and that a prophet who's an individual has to step forward and revivify it, right? And so there's tremendous emphasis on the utility of the individual. And you see that in...
And of course, both in Old and New Testament, it's God who sends the prophet. It's God who brings about the repentance of Israel and stuff like that. It's divine initiative taking place.
Judaism, I would say, overall, it's a very cohesive. It promotes in-group cohesion, let's say, but it also allows for individual expression in a very interesting ways, because there's tremendous emphasis in Jewish culture on learning and articulation and mastery of ideas, and so that provides this space for the individual to flourish. With Christianity, you see more of a move away, I would say, from the idea of the state Now, that's not necessarily without its troubles. One of the things Jung pointed out was, well, as Christianity becomes more about the individual, the religion itself tends to fragment like it did with Protestantism until it just fragments right to the point where every individual is their own church. And then you have no...
Wow, where have we heard that before? And, if that was Jung's criticism, then Jung didn't understand the centrality of Scripture and the work of the Spirit of God and amongst the people of God and all that kind of stuff. Or he was just simply saying, you've either got a total atomization, or you have either in Judaism or in Roman Catholicism, ultimate authority found in one person rather than in many people. I don't know. I haven't read Jung and have no intention of doing so in the future either, but maybe that's where it's coming from.
Continuity and no tradition. And the Catholics were kind of a bulwark against that. But I do think that there's a discussion to be had about the relative role of the individual in redeeming the world, let's say, versus the state in redeeming the world. And I would say the Christians come down more strongly on the side of the individual, and the Jews come down more strongly on the side of the state.
Yeah.
Now, I'm willing to be corrected about that because I've never actually been able to have a discussion with anyone about that. So I don't know what you think about that.
I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I think the idea of, in Hebrew, Am Yisrael, like the idea of the nation of Israel being paramount, and when you pray in collective terms. You don't pray in individual terms. Everything is done in terms of anachnu, in terms of we, praying as a group, right? You're supposed to pray in a minyan.
So how do you both square that away in your own ways? How do you square that away as someone that believes in the individual?
Because there's a lot of play in the joints.
Yeah.
There's a lot of play in the joints, meaning that so, for example, to take the most obvious example, if you want to talk about the power of the Jewish state in sort of biblical context, there's tremendous argument between whether a kingship is a good thing or a kingship is a bad thing in the Old Testament, right? I mean, it says like Samuel warns the Jewish people, if you take a king, here's what's going to happen. It's all going to suck, right? And then they form a kingship, and things suck. And so there's a strong case to be made that kingship was not actually what was wanted, because you have an entire period of just judges, and the judges are legitimately just individuals who are trusted by the people, but then can be supplanted at any time by another judge who's not from the lineage. So, Judaism, it matters to the extent that you're following God's law, but if you stray away from that, the idea, I think Judaism has always said that what you do is what makes you part of the group, not what you are. So Judaism has a weird dichotomy in it that's largely driven by exigent circumstances, which is the idea of biological Judaism versus the idea of religious Judaism. So I care very little about biological Judaism.
Not all who are of Israel are Israel. That might be one way of putting it.
When somebody says, somebody such and such is Jewish, Noam Chomsky is Jewish, like, so what? I really don't care. And I think that most Orthodox Jews, basically biological Judaism, or your mom was Jewish, which is the way that it works in Orthodox Judaism, is sort of the entry ticket to being Jewish, meaning you have to either have converted in, or your mom has to be Jewish in order for you to become fully Jewish. But the practice is what matters to me more than anything else. And that's where you get back into grace-based versus acts-based a little bit, right?
Well, that's another place where the group identity issue becomes paramount. It's like, well, there's this group, well, how is membership defined? Well, let's say it's defined by ethnicity, something like that, which would be related to the descent through the mother. It's like, well, that's a problem. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it's a problem because it demarcates a group. You say, well, this is a group that only we can belong to.
But what's weird is you can convert in. Right? This is why I say when there's play in the joints, a lot of the problems are solvable through the idea that you can convert in. So Judaism says you can't convert out, but then we don't punish people who leave, right? But which is different than Islam.
Yes. Yes, it's actually a relatively important difference.
That's right.
Point out.
But I mean, one of the people who I work with at my company, Andrew Clavin, is a guy who was born Jewish and now is Christian. Yeah. Right. So in my view, he's Jewish, but am I going to drag him down to my synagogue? That's not a thing. Right. So I think that
when did our language change, and what you say now is that's not a thing? It's pretty recent. It's been within the past couple of months. That's not a thing. My daughter does that. That's not a thing. But it is a thing. But it's not a thing. I can't keep up with it.
What the group identity, the one thing I will say for group identity is that what we have seen is that if there is lack of group identity, that group identity is filled usually by nefarious groups, meaning that that people do have a necessity. The idea of existing, that you find your meaning, or you find your purpose, or you find your identity just in yourself as an individual, is not only wrong, it's belied by virtually all of human history.
Careful, you're going to make an argument for identity politics.
Right, exactly.
Well, that's why I wanted to ask this question.
I understand.
But the point that, but what Judaism does, what America does, it says find your identity in the ideas.
Yeah.
Right, that's the difference. This is why I say I don't care about biological Judaism, particularly. I care much more about the ideas that you hold. So I'm in favor of group identity if group identity is built around a set of ideas that are worth preserving. I'm not in favor of group identity. I am a conservative. That's a group identity.
Right.
But that's an identifier more than it's an identity. Meaning it's a way of identifying me as a person who thinks this way. And because I think there are differences in modes of thought, then those group identities do matter. I mean, this is why we get together. This is why we have discussions. This is why we have friends.
Families.
Right. This is why we have families.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you said that the way you did, because I try to challenge myself on that all the time, because I talk about the individual, I believe in the individual, and I want to make sure that I'm not occasionally
But if we can find commonality,
back.
and this is what I think is one of the things that's broken down, is we used to have a common purpose. Like I have this framework that I'm working on in the book that I'm writing, where I basically say that in order for an individual to be happy, you need four things. You need individual purpose. You need individual capacity, like a feeling that you can accomplish that purpose, or at least make moves in that direction. You need a communal purpose. You do need to feel like you're a part of a group that's moving in the right direction, and you need communal capacity, which both allows the community to activate together and also protects your rights as an individual to do what you want to do in pursuit of your individual purpose. And that's the apotheosis of happiness, and that's what I think the Founding Fathers were trying to do in the United States, for example, set up a framework where you could fulfill all of these things. But you do need the idea of communal purpose. And one of the things that's happened post-Enlightenment is that people don't even think in terms of, they either think purely in terms of communal purpose or not at all in terms of communal purpose. So they think either purely in terms of communal purpose, and that's identity politics, meaning I'm black, therefore the black community should do X, right? Or I'm Jewish, therefore the Jewish community should do X. And then there are people who think not in terms of communal purpose at all, meaning full-on libertarian, I make my own meaning, we don't have to have anything in common, and that's a lie. Even libertarians believe we have to have an idea of liberty in common. Right,
and they have to live with other people.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, harmoniously.
And when we don't have any sort of communal purpose, when we live with a bunch of people with whom we share nothing, then it falls apart incredibly quickly.
Okay, so here's how the Christian drama looks to me. It addresses this issue, right? So Christ is presented as a figure who's an absolute master of his tradition, right? He's debating with the Jewish elders when he's 12. So think about it psychologically. Is first you're a child and you're dependent on your parents, and then you have to make the move from being a child dependent into the world. But you don't move from child to individual. You move from child to group. That's your teenage gang. That's your adolescence. You have to catalyze your group identity. If you don't have a group identity, it's actually a developmental failure, right? But then you might think, well, wait a second. Group identity is necessary, but is it the highest? Does it represent the highest plane of moral achievement? The answer to that is no. You have to emerge from your group as an individual. Okay, so now this is how I read the Christian story symbolically, and this is a consequence mostly of having studied Jung. He said,
to catch that, I just, because if you're sitting there going, what? You've got to understand the lens. You know, we've been talking about lenses recently. Well, Jordan Peterson has his lens, and that lens is Carl Jung. And it is psychology, and it is a certain psychological perspective. It has not come from the scriptures themselves. And so you end up with, well, illustration. I live in Phoenix, and this is a very bright valley, lots of lights. And some of you know I do a little astronomy. And, you know, I'll set my scope up in the backyard. It stinks to do this in Phoenix. We're low, there's dust everywhere, and there's light everywhere, and it's really hard to see anything. But I can put a filter on my lens, an O3 filter, that will primarily allow a certain range of light through that will make it easier to see things like nebula. But if I then turn the scope to something that it's not meant to be looking at with that filter, I won't even be able to see it. So a filter will determine what's going to get through and what you're going to see based upon the constituent makeup of that filter on a telescope. Same thing here. If your primary filter is Jungian psychology, then you're going to see Jesus symbolically representing these categories of human experience as Carl Jung has laid them out. What that means is a whole bunch of the revelations just gone. And what does get through will not be in the proper relationship to all the rest of the stuff, because the intermediate stuff that holds it all together consistently has been filtered out. And whether you're Ben Shapiro and that filter is a Judaism that rejects the messianic claims of Jesus, or Jordan Peterson, the filter is going to function as the filter.
Look, you need group identity. That's the persona that you wear. You have to have a persona. You have to be able to wear a suit. You have to simplify yourself for other people. You have to be able to play the game. Right. Otherwise, you just have failed developmentally. But if you're only a persona, then that's a big problem, partly because when the group goes insane, so do you. Okay, now you got to emerge out of the group. Okay, so now you need a symbol for what emerges out of the group. Okay, so Christ is the symbol of what should emerge out of the group, speaking psychologically. Bear the tragedy of life, speak the truth, be willing to transform through death. That's the rules. Now, I'm speaking purely psychologically. You learn something new. You learn it. It makes you suffer. The part of you that's wrong has to die. You have to let go of that. And it's hard, especially maybe you learn something profound. It's like you have to regrow an arm. It's really painful, you know. But you identify with the part of yourself that transforms through voluntary acceptance of suffering. Yeah. And that's what Christ represents as a symbol. And I think that that's correct symbolically. This is what actually severed the relationship between Jung and Freud, by the way, because Jung laid out his understanding of Christianity in those terms. And Freud, it wasn't a Jewish-Christian thing, though, because Freud was really, he was Jewish by ethnicity, but not by practice. Right. No, not at all. He just didn't want to have anything to do with religious ideation at all. He thought that would introduce, he called it like a black tidal wave of occultism back into what he regarded as a science. He had his point. But I think Jung got the symbolic structure right. And so what does that mean in relationship to Christianity and Judaism?
And just by the way, unfortunately, you can take biblical parameters, biblical stories, and fit them into almost any structure, as long as you're not trying to drive that structure from the scriptures themselves. And so liberation theology has done that, neo-Marxism has done that, but it's all dependent upon the filter you put on as to what you're going to get rid of and what you're not going to see. Because your authority is your observations of humanity rather than the clear revelation that God has given, which should then become the lens through which we see everything else. So this is someone looking from the outside in through a lens, and they're seeing some good stuff, but it's not the gospel. Rather than being regenerated, having that lens that is then provided as the new man being renewed by the Spirit of God. And now the lens you have is what you look outward on the world and make sense of the world around you in relationship to the one who made it and created it in the first place. That's a big difference. That's a really big difference.
It's really complicated because you have the prophetic tradition in Judaism, and the prophets are also symbols of people who emerge from the pathological group, who step forward courageously, and who reconstitute the group.
Yeah. So you believe these people could exist right now?
Which people?
The prophets.
I think prophets of sorts exist always.
Yeah.
I think Dostoevsky was a prophet. Nietzsche was clearly a prophet. I mean, he predicted what was going to happen in the 20th century. Yeah. Can you imagine predicting what's going to happen?
Because the reason I asked it like that was...
In case you're wondering who Nietzsche was, Nietzsche was the nihil, the nothing, the philosopher of emptiness, and God is dead, and he was a prophet. Obviously, we're using the words prophet in very, very, very different categories here. And you just got to keep that in mind. If you're going to appreciate Jordan Peterson, you're not going to appreciate him if you are not cognizant of the filters that are being applied and how they're functioning.
Because I think when you say prophets, I think people think of like someone coming down from heaven and they're going to have a halo on or some crazy thing. But you think that's what I was trying to get to, the realism.
I agree. I actually fully agree with this. In fact, so does Maimonides. I mean, Maimonides has an entire section in Guide for the Perplexed about prophecy. And what he says is there's Moses-level prophecy, which is the legislating prophet, and he says he's the only legislating prophet in the Jewish view. But all the other prophets are just people who see things incredibly clearly. Essentially, they're people who've studied philosophy and who have studied human morality and have studied,
which is not a biblical view of the prophets. God sends the prophets. God gives the message to the prophets. That is, Maimonides is far removed from the Old Testament and even from the Judaism of the days of Jesus.
A human being, and then that's
they're way down on the iceberg.
That's right.
That's the thing that makes them different.
Exactly. And so in that sense, people who predicting the thing about providing a certain level of stability for folks, and I think there are levels of prophecy is what I'll say. And I think that the better you are at recognizing human behavior and the interplay of forces, the better you are at saying, okay, here's what's going to happen next week. I think it's very difficult for anybody to say, here's what's going to happen in 100 years, because if you could predict that, you'd make a lot in the stock market. But I think that you could certainly, Well,
you can also get a sense of plate tectonics.
Right.
Like the details rub out, but and I think that's where we're at now. Like I believe we are in a war of ideas.
Yeah.
We're at a point where we're debating the validity of postmodernism.
And that was the end. Whoop. Hey, look at that. That was one of the earlier videos that for some reason this particular player just keeps track of everything. I haven't figured this video player out very well yet, obviously. That was one I had problems with before. Anyway, so a lot to cogitate upon there. I hope just a few interruptions, a few interactions gives you some context to sort of look at what's being said and why it's being said. And I realize, we can really appreciate, it's enjoyable to watch Ben Shapiro take apart a pro-lifer at an event or something like that. It's wonderful to see Jordan Peterson make, leftist media types drool. It's enjoyable, but we need to pray for both of them. And what would be wonderful is if they would have more interaction with serious Christians that can fill in the obvious gaps that exist in their understanding of the faith and challenge them with the claims of Christ. That's what's really needed.